The summer heat of New York City hung
Gentlemen,
heavy
this
in the
changes
air that
everything.
Monday afternoon,
Indeed, the
as though the
implications are
entire
staggering.
metropolis was
We
holding
need to
its
make a
breath.
decision soon.
Columbus
I
Circle,
know.
usually a noisy
But
crossroads
this
of
is not an
cars,
easy choice.
pedestrians, and impatient cab drivers, felt transformed. Thousands of people gathered, shoulder to shoulder, beneath a wide blue sky. Italian flags waved gently in the breeze. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view of the wooden stage built for the occasion. The smell of pretzels, roasted peanuts, and hot asphalt blended together in the warmth of the day. It was 28th June 1971, and the city was about to witness something both extraordinary and terrifying, a moment that would forever change the life and legacy of Joe Colombo. Colombo stood near the edge of the platform, his stocky frame dressed sharply, his dark hair slicked back in perfect order. He had the look of a man both confident and comfortable in the spotlight, but that in itself was unusual. This was not just any public figure. This was the boss of one of New York's 5 families, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America, a man who controlled rackets, gambling, and labor unions across the city. Traditionally, men like Colombo lived in the shadows, avoiding the public eye at all costs. Yet here he was, smiling, shaking hands, preparing to address a sea of supporters at the second annual Italian-American Unity Day rally. The crowd roared with anticipation. To them, Colombo was not a gangster, at least not today. To them, he was a defender of their dignity, a man who dared to confront the FBI, the newspapers, and the television networks that painted Italian Americans with the brush of criminality. For decades, headlines had made Mafia and Italian sound like synonyms. Colombo had taken that insult personally. Through his organization, the Italian American Civil Rights League, he had made it his mission to demand respect for his community. To some, he was a folk hero. To others, a dangerous opportunist using civil rights as a shield for his own criminal empire. At the edge of the crowd, a young man in a dark suit and tie pushed forward, carrying a camera with a press pass pinned to his jacket. His name was Jerome Johnson, though few would remember it. He looked nervous but determined, as though he had rehearsed what was about to happen. He had blended in perfectly with the photographers and reporters that always swarmed these events. No one stopped him as he approached the stage. No one questioned what he carried. Colombo's associates stood near the podium, scanning the crowd casually. The boss had been warned that his activism was making enemies, not just within the government but within the mafia itself. The commission, the Council of Mafia Bosses, had frowned upon his public crusade. His rallies, his television appearances, even his interviews with reporters were seen as a dangerous spotlight. "We don't exist," the old dons had always said. Colombo was breaking that rule. But Joe was fearless, or perhaps stubborn. He believed he could be both a don and a public figure, both a man of honor and a man of the people. The rally began with speeches, music, and patriotic chants. The crowd cheered as Colombo was introduced. He stepped toward the microphone, his face glowing with pride. Somewhere near the front, Jerome Johnson raised his arm. Witnesses later said it was so fast, so sudden, that for a moment no one understood what had happened. A small, sharp crack rang out, not the boom of a firework, but the sharp snap of a pistol. Then another. Joe Colombo fell. The crowd screamed. The flags that had been waving in celebration were now dropped, trampled in panic. People ducked, scrambled, shoved against each other trying to escape. Colombo's bodyguards lunged toward Johnson, tackling him, beating him savagely before he could fire again. The entire scene dissolved into chaos, a rally turned into a nightmare in the space of seconds. Blood pooled on the wooden planks of the stage, staining the podium. But Joe Colombo did not die. Miraculously, he was still breathing, though unconscious, as his men and medics rushed him into an ambulance. The city seemed to hold its breath again as news spread. The boss of the Colombo crime family, the face of Italian-American activism, had been gunned down in broad daylight at his own rally. As the sirens faded into the distance, the question lingered like smoke over Columbus Circle. Who wanted Joe Colombo silenced so badly that they would dare strike him here, in front of thousands of witnesses? Was it the FBI sending a message? Was it a rival family, tired of the attention Colombo brought to the Mafia's secret world? Or was it someone from within, a betrayal from his own ranks? This was not just another shooting in New York City. This was an act that shook the very foundation of organized crime. For the first time, a mafia boss had been attacked in public, not in the shadows. The gunfire that echoed that day would reverberate through the underworld for years to come, sparking new wars, shifting power, and leaving Joe Colombo suspended between life and death for the rest of his days. To understand how it came to this, how a boy from Carroll Gardens became the only Don to step into the spotlight and pay such a price, we must go back. Back to the narrow streets of Brooklyn, where Colombo's story truly began. Brooklyn in the 1920s was a world of its own, a patchwork of neighborhoods where languages and smells shifted block by block, where immigrant families tried to carve out a future with whatever tools they had. In Carroll Gardens, the narrow streets echoed with the voices of children playing stickball, the calls of fruit vendors, the chatter of women hanging laundry on lines strung between tenements. Life was simple, hard, and often crowded, but for the families who lived there, it was home. This was the world into which Joseph Colombo was born on 16th June 1923. His family was like many others, working-class Italian immigrants who had come to America searching for opportunity. His father, Anthony Colombo, was no stranger to the shadows of organized crime. He had been a respected figure in the underworld, an enforcer with ties to mafia families operating in Brooklyn. To young Joe, his father was a quiet, powerful presence, a man who seemed to command respect wherever he went. But Anthony's life would end tragically and early, leaving a void in the family that Joe would carry for the rest of his life. When Joe was still a boy, Anthony's body was found floating in the harbor, the victim of what many believed was a mob hit. No one was ever charged, no one ever spoke openly about it, but the message was clear: the underworld was dangerous, unforgiving, and final. For the Colombo family, this was not just a personal tragedy, it was a turning point. Joe's mother struggled to raise her children alone, taking on work and leaning on the support of neighbors and relatives. The boy who had once looked at his father with awe now had to grow up quickly. Joe grew up surrounded by the contradictions of his neighborhood. On one corner stood the Catholic Church, its bells calling families to Sunday Mass. On another stood a bar where wise guys gathered in sharp suits, sipping espresso, talking in low voices, flipping envelopes across tables. There was a rhythm to the streets, a balance between honest work and quiet corruption. Joe learned early that respect was everything. You treated people right, you stood up for your family, and you never allowed yourself to be pushed around. Even as a teenager, Colombo had a natural confidence. Friends would later describe him as calm, polite, and always neatly dressed, the kind of boy who seemed older than his years. He worked hard, taking odd jobs to help his mother keep the household running. For a time, he tried to follow the straight path. He became a longshoreman, one of the men who unloaded cargo from ships down at the docks. It was back-breaking work, long hours in the biting winter wind and the sweltering summer sun. But the waterfront was its own kind of school, and Joe paid attention. Down by the piers, you could see the way money and power flowed. There were foremen and union men, yes, but there were also men who didn't wear uniforms, who carried themselves like they owned the place. Everyone knew that organized crime controlled much of the waterfront, skimming from shipments, running protection rackets, and making sure certain containers mysteriously disappeared when the price was right. For a young man like Joe, it was impossible not to notice that the men who made the real money were not the ones breaking their backs. Colombo also spent time working as a real estate broker, a job that gave him a different view of the world, one that involved deals, negotiations, and handshakes that meant as much as contracts. He developed a knack for talking to people, for making them feel heard, for convincing them. This ability to persuade would later serve him well, both in business and in the mafia. But even as he tried to keep to legitimate work, the pull of the underworld was strong. The respect, the influence, the easy money, it was always there, just beyond reach. And Joe Colombo was ambitious. He didn't want to just scrape by, he wanted to be someone. He wanted to be the man other men looked up to, the one whose name carried weight in the neighborhood. In the evenings, after long days on the docks or in the office, Joe would walk the streets and watch the older wise guys gathering outside social clubs. They laughed easily, their voices carrying in the night air. They had nice cars, nice clothes, and a certain calm confidence that came from knowing they had protection, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Colombo's first steps into this world were careful, deliberate. He was smart enough not to rush, to build relationships slowly. He made himself useful, running small errands, keeping his mouth shut, proving he could be trusted. Trust was everything in that world. A man who talked too much, a man who made trouble, would not last long. By the time he reached his 20s, Joe Colombo had already gained a reputation as someone reliable, someone who could get things done without causing problems. He was not a thug, not a man who relied on brute force, though he was capable of handling himself if necessary. He preferred diplomacy, conversation, the quiet solution that left everyone satisfied. It was this combination, toughness and tact, that caught the attention of men higher up the ladder. Brooklyn in the post-war years was alive with opportunity for those willing to take risks. The mafia was evolving, moving from the old bootlegging days of prohibition into more sophisticated rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. For Colombo, the time was right. The boy from Carroll Gardens was ready to step out of the shadows of his father's death and make a name for himself. And yet, even as he stood on the edge of that world, there was still a part of Joe that held on to the lessons of his childhood: protect your family, earn respect, and never back down. Those lessons would guide him as he took the next steps that would lead him deeper into the life, deeper into power, and ultimately, deeper into danger. By the late 1940s, Joe Colombo had learned how the streets worked and, more importantly, how to move through them without drawing unnecessary attention. He was no stranger to the longshoreman's life, but he was beginning to see that a man could work his fingers to the bone and still never have more than just enough to survive. In the social clubs and cafes of Brooklyn, he had watched other men with reputations, live better. They had money, influence, and most importantly, they had control over their lives. Joe was ready to take a step closer to that world. His first ventures into crime were small, careful, and meant to test the waters. Colombo got involved in minor rackets, the kind of street-level operations that kept neighborhoods running under the mob's silent management. He took part in hijacking operations, stealing trucks filled with goods, and quietly selling the merchandise on the black market. These were not Hollywood-style shootouts or violent stick-ups, but carefully timed thefts where planning was everything. The truck would vanish, the driver would walk away unharmed, and within hours the cargo would be in the hands of someone willing to pay cash, no questions asked. Colombo had a talent for organizing these moves without chaos. He preferred efficiency over bloodshed, diplomacy over threats, but he was no fool. He knew that fear was sometimes necessary, that a man's reputation could be his greatest protection. If someone tried to cross him, Joe would make sure the message was clear and firm, though never more violent than it had to be. It was this level-headed approach that earned him respect in the streets and brought him to the attention of men in the Prophecy crime family, one of New York's powerful 5 families. During this time, Colombo also faced brushes with the law. Police raids were common, and arrests were practically a rite of passage for any young man climbing the ranks. Joe was picked up a few times for suspicion of theft, possession of stolen property, and other low-level charges. Most of these cases quietly disappeared, either for lack of evidence or because witnesses developed sudden cases of forgetfulness. In the rare cases that made it to court, Colombo kept his composure, speaking politely to judges, never losing his temper. He began to cultivate an image, a man who was smart, calm, and respectable even in trouble. But it wasn't just Colombo's cool temperament that drew the eye of higher-ups, it was his ability to win people over. He had a natural charisma, a way of making allies out of potential rivals. He was not loud or flashy. Unlike some young gangsters who bragged about their crimes, Joe stayed quiet, let his actions speak for themselves, and let others sing his praises. The Prophecy family had long been known for its discipline and order. Led by Joe Prophecy, nicknamed the Olive Oil King for his legitimate business empire, the family valued loyalty and discretion above all else. This was a perfect fit for Colombo, who believed in maintaining peace when possible and keeping business organized. He began working more closely with Prophecy's men, running numbers, collecting debts, and smoothing over disputes between feuding associates. As Colombo became more trusted, he was brought into higher-level operations. Labor racketeering, for instance, was one of the most profitable ventures on the Brooklyn waterfront, and Joe's experience as a longshoreman made him a natural choice to help manage these affairs. He knew the men on the docks, knew the foremen, knew which palms needed to be greased to keep cargo moving or to stop it when that was more profitable. Every successful job, every problem solved quietly, added another layer to Colombo's reputation. He was a man who could be counted on. A man who thought before he acted. A man who could make money without making enemies. At least, not more than necessary. It was during these years that Colombo began to truly understand the power of the Mafia's unspoken code, omerta, the code of silence. To talk was to betray, and betrayal was the worst crime of all. Joe kept his word, never spoke out of turn, and never brought heat on the family. His loyalty was noticed, and slowly but surely, he moved closer to the inner circle. In the evenings, Colombo would often sit in the back of a social club, sipping espresso, listening more than talking. The older men discussed politics, business, and the changing world after World War II. Colombo absorbed it all, the way deals were struck with a nod and a handshake, the way respect was given and taken. He learned that being a successful mobster was not just about muscle, it was about intelligence, timing, and patience. But it was also about ambition. Colombo's ambitions were quietly growing. He wanted more than just a piece of the action. He wanted a seat at the table where real decisions were made. He had seen what happened to men who stayed too long at the bottom. They became expendable. If he was going to survive and thrive, he needed to climb higher. The path ahead was dangerous. The world of organized crime was not forgiving, and a single mistake could mean prison or death. But Joe Colombo had something many others lacked: a vision. He didn't just want to make money, he wanted to bring order, to run things smoothly, to rise in a way that did not leave chaos in his wake. This mindset, part businessman, part peacemaker, would define him as he took the next step into the life. Soon, Colombo would face bigger challenges, bigger risks, and bigger rewards. He had proven himself at the street level. Now came the moment to prove himself to the bosses, to earn his place in the family in a way that could never be taken back. The next chapter in his life would not just be about survival, it would be about transformation, the moment when Joseph Colombo would truly become a man of the mafia. The world Joe Colombo had been circling was about to open its doors to him fully. For years, he had been operating on the fringes, trusted enough to handle important jobs but not yet fully inducted into the inner sanctum of mafia life. That was about to change. To be officially recognized as a member of the Prophecy crime family, to become a made man, was the highest honor a street-level associate could hope for. It was a moment that would bind Joe to the organization for life, a commitment as sacred and serious as any vow. The process was shrouded in secrecy, steeped in ritual that traced back generations to the old country. Colombo was summoned quietly, told to meet at a secure location, one that would be free of prying eyes and ears. The room was simple, dimly lit, with only a few chairs and a small table. Around that table sat men he had known and worked with for years, men who had been watching him, testing him, deciding whether he was truly ready. At the head of the table sat Joe Prophecy himself, the man whose approval meant everything. Colombo was asked to swear an oath, one of loyalty, silence, and obedience. A holy card depicting a saint was placed in his hands, and his finger was pricked with a needle. A drop of blood fell onto the card, which was then set aflame and passed between his palms. As the fire burned, Colombo was told that just as the card turned to ash, so too would he turn to ash if he betrayed the family. It was a solemn moment, one that Colombo would never forget. In that instant, he was no longer just Joe Colombo, the ambitious kid from Carroll Gardens. He was now a soldier in the Prophecy crime family, part of something far bigger than himself. From that day forward, everything changed. With his new status came greater responsibility and greater earning potential. Colombo was given more significant rackets to oversee, more complicated disputes to mediate, and more dangerous tasks to handle. But he was also given protection. As a made man, he could not be harmed without permission from the boss himself. That protection gave him confidence and allowed him to move more boldly in business. Colombo proved himself again and again as someone who preferred order over chaos. While other gangsters were quick to solve problems with violence, Joe favored diplomacy whenever possible. He believed that wars were bad for business, that bloodshed only brought heat from the police and the press. He earned a reputation as a man who could smooth things over, a peacemaker who kept money flowing and tempers cool. One of his key strengths was his ability to connect with people from all walks of life. He could sit down with a union boss 1 hour, a street tough the next, and a businessman later that night, and make each man feel as though he was being heard. He was approachable, charming without being overbearing, and when he made a promise, he kept it. These qualities did not go unnoticed. Prophecy himself took a liking to Colombo. The Don saw in Joe a younger version of himself, shrewd, business-minded, and willing to work hard for the family's interests. Prophecy rewarded Colombo's loyalty by giving him more territory to manage and more trust in the family's day-to-day operations. Colombo began to earn serious money. The waterfront rackets were a steady source of income, but he also branched into gambling, shylocking, and legitimate investments that provided a respectable front. With money came status. Colombo bought a house in Queens and provided his wife and children with a comfortable life. He was known as a devoted family man, always home for dinner when he could be, attending school functions, and keeping his personal life relatively quiet compared to some of his flashier counterparts. This dual life, loving father by day, calculating mobster by night, added to his mystique. But Colombo's rise was not without challenges. The Prophecy family was not without its share of troubles. Disputes within the family occasionally flared up, and rival gangs were always testing boundaries. Joe handled these situations with the same calm, steady approach he brought to everything else. He built alliances where he could, and when confrontation was unavoidable, he made sure it was swift and decisive. In those years, Colombo was learning what it meant to be more than just a soldier. He was learning how to lead. He watched Prophecy closely, studying the older man's leadership style, how he rewarded loyalty, how he kept peace among strong-willed captains, how he balanced business with tradition. These lessons would serve Colombo well in the years to come, though he could never have imagined just how high he would climb or how quickly. By the late 1950s, Colombo was a rising star within the Prophecy organization. He had earned respect not just from his immediate crew but from other members of the family and even figures from outside families who appreciated his fairness and reliability. He had money, he had influence, and he had a growing sense of destiny. And yet, the underworld was never without its dangers. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. The Prophecy family, despite its outward stability, was heading toward a turbulent period that would test everyone's loyalty, including Joe Colombo's. For now, though, Joe stood at the threshold of real power. He had made his bones, sworn the oath, and earned his place. The boy from Carroll Gardens had become a man of honor, a man whose word carried weight, a man whose future seemed brighter than ever. What he did not know was that this future would soon be shaped by conflict, blood, and choices that would define him forever. The Prophecy family had long been considered one of the more stable of New York's 5 families, known for its discipline and its boss's old-world values. Joe Prophecy was a man who prided himself on being both a devout Catholic and a cunning businessman, a man who controlled his family with a quiet but iron hand. But by the early 1960s, cracks were forming beneath the surface. Prophecy's methods, particularly his heavy tribute demands on his captains, were breeding resentment. At the center of this growing storm was a fiery, ambitious crew leader named Joey Gallo. Joey Gallo, known on the streets as Crazy Joe, was everything Colombo was not. Where Colombo was calm and diplomatic, Gallo was impulsive, theatrical, and willing to use violence to get what he wanted. Gallo and his brothers controlled a powerful crew in Brooklyn and had grown tired of Prophecy's demands. Prophecy required all his capos to kick up a portion of their earnings to him personally, a tradition known as the house tax. For years they had paid without question, but the percentage had grown so high that many felt squeezed. Gallo decided to do the unthinkable. He openly defied the boss. The conflict that followed became known as the Prophecy-Gallo War, one of the bloodiest internal conflicts the New York Mafia had ever seen. It began with a bold move that shocked the underworld. Gallo and his crew kidnapped several high-ranking members of the Prophecy family, including underboss Joseph Magliocco and consigliere Salvatore Musacchia. They were held hostage in an attempt to force Prophecy to renegotiate the tribute arrangement and reduce the tax burden. This was an unprecedented challenge to a sitting boss, and it threw the family into chaos. Prophecy, unwilling to appear weak, agreed to meet some of the crew's demands, but as soon as his men were released, he plotted revenge. What followed was a cycle of retribution, shootings, ambushes, and assassinations that turned the streets of Brooklyn into a battlefield. For Joe Colombo, this was a dangerous time. As a loyal soldier to Prophecy, he had to walk a fine line between supporting the boss and keeping his own crew safe from the escalating violence. Colombo was not a man who relished war. He knew that every gunfight brought police attention, and every headline about mafia bloodshed brought federal pressure. But he also knew that loyalty to the boss was paramount. Colombo became something of a stabilizing force during the conflict. While others were eager to settle scores with bullets, he preferred to use diplomacy where possible, arranging meetings, trying to negotiate ceasefires, and keeping his part of the organization focused on making money rather than making headlines. His ability to remain calm under pressure and keep business running smoothly did not go unnoticed by Prophecy, who came to see him as one of his most reliable men. Still, the war dragged on. The Gallo crew was fierce and determined, and their defiance became legendary. They used hit-and-run tactics, ambushing Prophecy loyalists, disappearing into the streets before anyone could catch them. They bombed cars, fired into bars, and left bodies in alleys. In response, Prophecy loyalists struck back, leaving the gallows constantly looking over their shoulders. The neighborhoods of Brooklyn felt the tension like a drumbeat. Ordinary citizens kept their heads down, knowing that stray bullets didn't care who you were. Social clubs stayed half empty as men avoided gathering in places that might be targeted. Fear became part of daily life. During this period, Colombo's ability to keep his crew disciplined became one of his greatest assets. He did not allow his men to act recklessly. He insisted on structure, on following orders, on minimizing unnecessary risk. This discipline kept his people alive and his earnings steady, even as the rest of the family was bleeding money and men. Then, in 1962, Joe Prophecy died of cancer. His death marked the end of an era and created a power vacuum at the worst possible time. Joseph Magliocco, the underboss who had once been kidnapped by the gallows, stepped into the role of boss, but his grip on the family was weaker than Prophecy's had ever been. The war simmered on, and Magliocco's leadership faced challenges not just from within the family but from the other New York bosses as well. It was during this turbulent transition that Joe Colombo's star began to rise even higher. He had proven himself a steady hand during the crisis, and his reputation as a man who could bring order to chaos was now well established. While other captains saw their crews diminished by violence, Colombo's remained strong. He had kept them alive, kept them earning, and kept them loyal. Behind the scenes, Colombo was careful. He did not overstep his position or act as though he were more important than he was. But he was quietly building alliances, strengthening relationships with key figures, and making sure that when the time came for a new leader to emerge, his name would be one of those considered. The Gallo War was a crucible that burned away the weak and left only the strong standing. For Colombo, it was the proving ground that showed he was more than just another soldier or captain. He was a man who could weather a storm, who could keep his head when others were losing theirs, who could protect his men and still turn a profit in the middle of a war zone. As the conflict began to settle, and as the Commission, the governing council of the Mafia, looked for ways to restore peace, Joe Colombo found himself in a position no one had predicted, a man trusted by all sides, respected by allies, and even grudgingly by enemies. The streets would quiet eventually, the bloodshed would slow, but the lessons learned during the Gallo War would stay with Colombo for the rest of his life. He had seen firsthand how quickly a family could be torn apart by greed, ego, and ambition. And he had learned that a true leader needed more than just muscle, he needed vision, patience, and the ability to bring men together when everything was falling apart. These qualities would soon propel Joe Colombo into a role he had never expected, one that would make him the youngest boss in America, and the only Don ever bold enough to step out of the shadows and into the public eye. The death of Joe Prophecy had left the family shaken, and Joseph Magliocco's brief time as boss did little to steady the ship. Magliocco was a capable man in many ways, but he lacked the quiet authority that Prophecy had commanded. He also made a critical mistake, one that would open the door for Joe Colombo's unexpected rise. In the aftermath of Prophecy's passing, Magliocco became entangled in a dangerous plot. Together with Joseph Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno family, he allegedly conspired to assassinate the heads of two other New York families, Carlo Gambino and Tommy Luchese, as part of a plan to seize greater control of the Commission. It was a bold and reckless scheme, one that risked plunging all of New York into war if it were discovered. And it was discovered. The plot unraveled before a single bullet could be fired. The Commission, outraged by the conspiracy, summoned Magliocco and demanded an explanation. Facing certain death if he resisted, Magliocco admitted to his role in the plot but claimed he had been pressured into it by Bonanno. In exchange for sparing his life, Magliocco was forced to pay a heavy fine and step down as boss. The family suddenly found itself without a leader, at a time when stability was desperately needed. It was here that Joe Colombo entered the picture. To many, Colombo was still a relatively young captain, only in his early 40s. He was not considered the most powerful or the most feared member of the family, but he had something others lacked. He was trusted by the Commission. Colombo had been the one who quietly informed the Commission of the assassination plot, a move that had prevented bloodshed and potentially saved countless lives. To the other bosses, this showed that Colombo valued order over chaos, that he would put the greater good of the Mafia ahead of reckless ambition. With Magliocco gone, the Commission faced a decision. They could appoint one of the older, more established captains to take over, but many of those men were tainted by their loyalty to Magliocco or their involvement in past conflicts. Colombo, by contrast, had kept his hands clean during the family wars, had maintained a steady flow of income, and had demonstrated cool judgment during a time of crisis. In 1963, at just 41 years old, Joe Colombo was named boss of the family. It was a stunning move. He was the youngest head of a mafia family in America, a man who had risen from soldier to boss in a remarkably short time. To some, he seemed too young, too untested for such a position. But to others, he represented a fresh start, a chance to leave the turmoil of the prophecy era behind and build something more stable. Colombo wasted no time in making his mark. One of his first and boldest decisions was to rename the family. No longer would it be known as the Prophecy family. From that moment on, it would be called the Colombo family. This was unheard of. Traditionally, mafia families were named after their founding boss and retained that name even after leadership changed hands. By putting his own name on the family, Colombo was declaring to the world and to the underworld that a new era had begun. This decision was not without risk. Some saw it as arrogance, a young man overstepping tradition. But Colombo was careful to balance this bold move with respect for the past. He treated Prophecy's remaining loyalists with care, rewarding those who stayed true and bringing them into his fold. He knew that to survive as boss, he needed unity, not division. Colombo's leadership style was distinctive. He preferred negotiation over violence and believed in running the family like a well-organized business. He worked to resolve lingering disputes from the Prophecy Gallo War, bringing peace to a family that had been fractured for years. He rewarded loyalty with opportunities to earn, giving his captains and soldiers a reason to support his rule. At the same time, Colombo understood the importance of appearances. He began to cultivate an image not just as a boss, but as a respectable businessman and community figure. He kept a low profile in the early days of his reign, careful not to attract unnecessary law enforcement attention, but he also made sure that those in the underworld knew he was firmly in control. Colombo's rise to power was remarkable not just because of his age, but because of the way he managed to consolidate power so quickly and without bloodshed. In a world where leadership transitions often involved gunfire and betrayal, Colombo's ascent was almost peaceful. This, too, earned him respect. But while Colombo's early years as boss were marked by stability and growth, there were already signs that he would not be content to remain in the shadows forever. He was ambitious, yes, but also visionary. He saw himself not merely as the head of a crime family, but as a man who could shape the future for his people, for all Italian Americans. For now, though, Joe Colombo was at the height of his power. He had survived the Prophecy Gallo War, navigated the treacherous politics of the Commission, and claimed the throne without spilling blood. He had turned a fractured organization into a united one, and he had put his own name on the family, ensuring that his legacy would endure. But power has a way of testing a man, and Colombo was about to face challenges unlike anything he had seen before. The decisions he would make in the years ahead would not only change his own life, but also alter the very relationship between the mafia and the public. By the mid-1960s, Joe Colombo had fully grown into the role of boss, and it was clear to everyone, friends, rivals, and law enforcement alike, that he intended to run his family differently than most. Where other dons ruled with fear, Colombo ruled with a mix of charm, intelligence, and quiet authority. His approach was practical. He believed a well-run family should operate like a business, one where everyone knew their role, their percentage, and the rules they were expected to follow. The first thing Colombo did was restore order. Years of war had drained morale, and many soldiers were still bitter from the bloodshed of the Gallo conflict. Colombo made it his mission to unify the ranks. He held meetings with his capos, spoke to them one-on-one, reassured them that under his leadership there would be opportunity for everyone. The message was clear: loyalty would be rewarded, and there was plenty of money to go around if everyone focused on business rather than vendettas. Colombo also worked hard to repair relations with the other families. The prophecy wars had drawn outside attention and risked violating the fragile peace among New York's 5 families. Colombo personally reached out to bosses like Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lachise, signaling that he wanted to put the past behind them. He made it known that his administration would honor commission rules and maintain cooperation on shared interests. This diplomacy paid off. Colombo was respected as a man who could be trusted to keep the streets quiet and profitable. Under his leadership, the Colombo family's rackets flourished. Loan sharking remained one of the biggest moneymakers, with Colombo's crew lending money at high interest rates to gamblers, businessmen, and anyone desperate enough to borrow. Gambling operations, numbers games, dice games, card rooms brought in steady cash. There were bookmaking operations that took bets on horse racing and sports, providing entertainment for thousands of New Yorkers who trusted the mob more than they trusted the state lottery. Labor racketeering was perhaps Colombo's most powerful tool. Through control of key unions, he could influence construction projects, shipping schedules, and contract awards. The waterfront, which he knew so well, remained a steady source of income. Trucks didn't move, ships didn't unload, and concrete didn't pour unless certain envelopes were filled and certain nods were given. For Colombo, this was power, quiet, invisible, and immensely profitable. But unlike some of his contemporaries, Colombo did not flaunt his wealth recklessly. He was known as a sharp dresser, and he enjoyed the good life, but he did not live like a movie gangster. There were no gold-plated Cadillacs or garish displays of excess. He preferred a life that balanced comfort with discretion. He invested in legitimate businesses, including real estate, giving himself a public image as a respectable entrepreneur. Colombo's ability to move between the criminal underworld and the world of legitimate business set him apart. He had an easy charm that made people want to deal with him. Whether it was a small-time hustler looking for a loan or a businessman trying to get a project approved, Colombo could talk to them as equals, find a solution, and leave both sides feeling they had won. He also kept a close eye on law enforcement pressure. Colombo knew the FBI was always watching, and he worked hard to minimize exposure. He discouraged reckless behavior among his men, warning them that unnecessary violence and public spectacles only brought trouble. If a problem could be solved quietly, it was. If discipline needed to be administered, it was done in a way that sent a message but avoided headlines. At home, Colombo's life was surprisingly ordinary for a mafia boss. He lived with his wife, Lucille, and their children in a comfortable home in Queens. Neighbors described him as polite, approachable, and even generous. He attended church, supported local charities, and seemed devoted to his family. Unlike some dons who kept mistresses and lived double lives, Colombo projected the image of a devoted husband and father. This balance, ruthless businessman on the streets, family man at home, made him something of an enigma. To law enforcement, he was still a dangerous criminal, a man at the top of a powerful organization. But to many in the community, he was a figure of respect, someone who kept order and even looked out for the neighborhood. And yet, beneath this period of calm, something was stirring in Colombo. He had always been ambitious, but now that he had achieved power, he began to think about legacy. Most mafia bosses were content to make money and stay out of sight. Colombo began to wonder if that was enough. Was it possible for a man like him, a Don, to be something more? Could he use his position not just to enrich himself, but to change the way Italian Americans were seen and treated in America? This idea would soon take root in Colombo's mind and grow into something unprecedented. But for now, he was at the height of his power, respected, wealthy, and in control of one of the most stable families in New York. It was a moment of relative peace, a calm before a storm that would redefine the relationship between the mafia and the world beyond its code of silence. Colombo had succeeded in turning a fractured organization into a thriving enterprise. His diplomacy had earned him friends where there had once been enemies. His steady hand had kept his men loyal and productive. In many ways, he was the ideal Don for a modern era, businesslike, forward-thinking, and committed to keeping bloodshed to a minimum. But even as he sat at the top, Colombo was preparing to step into uncharted territory. His next move would be unlike anything any mafia boss had ever attempted, taking his fight out of the shadows and into the public eye. And once he did, there would be no turning back. It began with a complaint, not a shout, not a gunshot, just a quiet grievance that had been gnawing at Joe Colombo for years. He had worked his way up from the streets, become a boss, made peace among warring factions, and turned his family into a model of organization. And yet, every time he opened a newspaper or turned on the television, he saw the same thing: Italians painted as criminals, monsters, gangsters in fedoras and dark suits. Every indictment, every FBI raid, every crime headline seemed to use the word mafia like a label not just for criminals, but for all Italian Americans. Colombo was not a man who liked unfairness. In his mind, this was an insult, not just to him, but to every honest Italian trying to make a living in America. Yes, he was a boss. Yes, he ran rackets, but that didn't mean his entire heritage should be slandered. He wanted his children to grow up proud of who they were, not ashamed because of the stereotypes that filled newspapers and TV dramas. In 1970, Colombo decided to do something unheard of. He took his fight public. He founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization that claimed to represent the interests of all Italian Americans. Its official mission was to combat discrimination, fight negative stereotypes, and promote unity and pride within the community. But Colombo was not just talking about pride, he was challenging one of the most powerful institutions in the country, the FBI. For decades, the FBI had maintained that the Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, didn't officially exist, even while secretly investigating it. When Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy began aggressively targeting organized crime in the early 1960s, the term Mafia became a constant headline. Colombo accused the government of using that word as a smear against all Italian Americans. He called for the FBI to stop publicly using the term Mafia altogether, insisting that it unfairly linked an entire ethnic group to crime. It was a shocking move for a man who was himself under FBI surveillance and had open criminal cases pending. But Colombo understood the power of publicity. He began holding press conferences, giving interviews, and speaking openly about Italian-American pride. In a world where mafia bosses traditionally stayed invisible, Colombo stood in front of cameras and microphones, smiling, polished, almost presidential. The League's message resonated. Thousands of ordinary Italian-Americans felt they finally had a voice. They were tired of seeing every crime movie and crime story portray them as gangsters. They rallied to Colombo's cause, signing petitions, donating money, and attending events. The real turning point came when Colombo announced the first Italian-American Unity Day rally to be held in Columbus Circle in Manhattan. The idea was to celebrate Italian culture, demand fair treatment, and show the world that Italians were not all criminals. On that day, more than 50,000 people turned out. They carried signs that read "Italian Americans are not criminals," waved flags, and cheered as speakers denounced discrimination. Colombo himself took the stage, his voice calm but commanding, delivering a message that was both defiant and inspiring. "We will no longer accept being branded with a word that insults us," he told the crowd. "We are proud Americans. We will not allow the dignity of our people to be dragged through the mud." This was more than a rally, it was a spectacle. The media covered it extensively, and suddenly Joe Colombo was not just a mafia boss in the shadows. He was a national figure, a man whose face was on the evening news, whose name was in the papers next to words like activist and civil rights. But not everyone was pleased. Inside the mafia, Colombo's actions were raising eyebrows. The commission had always maintained a simple rule: stay out of the spotlight. The strength of the mafia had always been its secrecy. Colombo was breaking that rule in a spectacular way. By putting himself in front of cameras, he risked drawing more law enforcement attention not just to himself, but to every boss, every family, every racket. Some of the other dons warned him privately to scale back his activism. Carlo Gambino, the quiet and calculating boss of the Gambino family, reportedly told him that his public appearances were dangerous. But Colombo refused to back down. He believed he was doing something bigger than the mafia, something that would outlast his time as boss. He continued to build the League, turning it into a real force. He organized boycotts against businesses that discriminated against Italians, pressured television networks to avoid using words like mafia and cosa nostra in shows and news broadcasts, and even influenced major film productions. When Paramount Pictures began filming The Godfather, the League staged protests until the filmmakers agreed to remove all references to mafia from the script. Colombo declared this a victory, proof that the League could shape how Italians were portrayed in popular culture. The momentum was intoxicating. Membership grew rapidly, money poured in, and Unity Day became an annual event that drew tens of thousands. Colombo was no longer just a crime boss. He was becoming a community leader, a folk hero to many, a man who seemed to straddle two worlds at once. But as Colombo's public profile rose, so too did the danger. Law enforcement stepped up its investigations, determined to find ways to bring him down. Rival bosses began to worry that Colombo's actions would bring heat on everyone. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was making plans to silence him before his activism changed the underworld forever. Colombo, however, remained undeterred. He was convinced that he could keep walking this tightrope, that he could be both don and activist, both enforcer and spokesman for his people. He believed he was untouchable, that his popularity gave him protection. And for a time, it seemed he was right. But history would prove otherwise. The more Colombo stepped into the light, the more he made himself a target, and the stage was being set for a day when that target would be too tempting for someone to ignore. The morning of the first Italian-American Unity Day felt charged with energy, as if the city itself knew something unusual was about to happen. Columbus Circle, that busy Manhattan landmark where Broadway and 8th Avenue meet, slowly transformed into a gathering place. The air was warm but not oppressive, and the summer sky stretched above like a pale blue canvas. Early in the day, workers assembled the stage, a simple wooden platform draped in the green, white, and red colors of the Italian flag. Loudspeakers were mounted on poles so that the crowd's cheers and the speeches would echo through the surrounding streets. Soon, the first waves of people began arriving. Families with children, old men in hats, young women with cameras, they came from Brooklyn, from Queens, from Staten Island, even from out of state. They carried handmade signs that read "Justice for Italian Americans" and "Stop using the word mafia." By noon, the crowd had swelled into the tens of thousands. It was no longer just a rally, it was a sea of humanity. Columbus Circle was packed so tightly that traffic had to be rerouted. Street vendors sold sausages, pretzels, and lemonade as musicians played Italian folk songs. The smell of roasted peanuts and city asphalt filled the air. People climbed on benches and fire hydrants to get a better view of the stage. At the center of it all, Joe Colombo waited calmly. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, a dark tailored suit, crisp white shirt, a patterned tie that caught the sunlight when he turned his head. His hair was perfectly combed, his posture upright, his face serious but approachable. He looked less like a Mafia Don and more like a politician, which was exactly how he wanted to be seen. When it was time for him to speak, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. The noise was so loud that even Colombo seemed taken aback for a moment. He raised his hands to quiet them, and a hush fell over the square. The city's normal hum of traffic and horns was replaced by an expectant silence. Colombo's voice, when it came through the loudspeakers, was steady and warm, carrying just enough Brooklyn edge to remind everyone where he came from. He began by thanking the crowd for coming, for standing up for themselves, for refusing to let their heritage be dragged through the mud. "They call us Mafia," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "They use that word to make every one of us look guilty. Well, I say no more. We are not criminals, we are hard-working Americans. We have fought for this country. We have built this city with our hands. We have raised families, started businesses, and lived by the values of respect and honor. And we will not be branded any longer." The crowd roared. Flags waved. Some people cried, others shouted Colombo's name like he was a folk hero. He went on to demand that the FBI stop using the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra in public statements. He urged television networks and newspapers to portray Italian Americans fairly, to stop making gangster movies that painted them all as criminals. Colombo's speech was part civil rights rally, part political rally, and part neighborhood gathering. It was emotional without being angry, passionate without losing control. He spoke like a man who believed deeply in what he was saying, and his charisma was undeniable. For the ordinary people in the crowd, it was a day of pride. They felt seen, heard, represented. For years they had watched as their culture was associated with crime in the public imagination. Now, here was someone with a voice loud enough to fight back. But there was another layer to the rally, one that not everyone could see. Mixed in among the ordinary citizens were Colombo's men standing watch. They blended in with the crowd, but their eyes were sharp, scanning for threats. Colombo knew he was taking a risk by appearing in public like this. His advisors had warned him that not everyone in the underworld was happy about his activism. Some feared he was bringing too much attention to the mafia's existence. The press, of course, was everywhere: photographers, television crews, reporters scribbling notes. They captured every moment, every cheer, every wave of the flags. The next day, pictures of Colombo standing at the microphone, fist raised, would appear on the front pages of New York's biggest papers. When the speeches ended, the rally turned into a celebration. People sang, hugged, and stayed long after the stage had been dismantled, as if reluctant to leave this moment of unity. Colombo lingered too, shaking hands, smiling for pictures, talking with community leaders. He was relaxed, confident, seemingly untouchable. What no one could know was that this very success was planting the seeds of danger. The rally had proven that Colombo could mobilize tens of thousands of people, that he could command media attention at will, that he could turn his cause into a movement. To law enforcement, this made him more of a threat, not less. To rival bosses, it made him a liability. That night, as Colombo returned home, he was in high spirits. The rally had been a triumph. The League's membership was growing, donations were flowing in, and the press coverage was overwhelmingly positive. He had not just spoken for his people, he had made history. But somewhere in the shadows, someone else was making plans. They had seen the same rally, the same coverage, and reached a different conclusion. Colombo was too visible, too powerful, too dangerous. If he was not stopped, he might inspire others to step into the light, to bring the mafia's world out of the shadows. And that was something the old guard could never allow. For now, though, the streets of New York were quiet, and Joe Colombo slept soundly. The first Italian-American Unity Day had been a victory. The movement was only beginning, and the man at its center was ready to take it even further, no matter the cost. In the weeks and months after the first Italian-American Unity Day rally, Joe Colombo's name was everywhere. Newspapers that once printed his name only in connection with indictments now quoted him as a spokesman for the Italian-American community. Television crews followed him as he walked down Mulberry Street in Little Italy, shaking hands and smiling like a man running for office. For many ordinary people, Colombo had become something larger than life, a symbol that they could be proud of their heritage without apology. Colombo capitalized on this momentum. The Italian-American Civil Rights League became more than just a rallying cry, it became an organization with real influence. Local chapters were formed in cities across the country. Meetings were held where people could air grievances about discrimination, being passed over for promotions, being stereotyped on television, even being targeted unfairly by law enforcement. Colombo positioned himself as their advocate, promising to speak for them, to take their concerns to the highest levels of government. He built alliances outside the underworld. Prominent lawyers, judges, and business owners began attending League events. Politicians, always alert to the power of a voting bloc, saw an opportunity and began courting Colombo's favor. He was invited to luncheons, charity galas, and private meetings where city officials discussed ways to improve relations with the Italian-American community. Colombo understood the value of these connections. Every handshake, every photograph with a politician or community leader made him look more legitimate. He was careful, too, about his public image. He never appeared at league events surrounded by too many obvious wise guys. Instead, he favored a mix of businessmen, union leaders, and respected community figures. The message was subtle but clear. He was not just a mafia boss, he was a man of the people. Yet behind the polished smile and public speeches, Colombo's other life never went away. He was still running a powerful crime family, still overseeing rackets that generated millions. The FBI knew this, and they stepped up their efforts to catch him. Colombo's phones were tapped, his movements watched, his meetings photographed from surveillance vans parked down the block. Federal agents believed that the League was, at least in part, a shield, a way for Colombo to launder his reputation, gather political support, and deflect attention from his criminal activities. For Colombo, the pressure from law enforcement was nothing new. What worried him more was the growing tension within the underworld itself. The other bosses were becoming restless. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful of them all, was a man who believed in staying quiet, keeping business out of the public eye. To Gambino, Colombo's rallies were reckless. They put too much attention on the mafia, attention that could lead to indictments, arrests, and congressional hearings. Tommy Lachis, another old-school Don, reportedly shared Gambino's concerns. Even Joseph Bonanno, who had once been known for his own boldness, criticized Colombo's public appearances. The mafia had survived for decades precisely because it operated in the shadows, and Colombo seemed determined to drag it into the light. Whispers began to circulate. Some captains within Colombo's own family worried that the boss was becoming too focused on activism and not focused enough on business. There were grumblings about the League taking too much time, too much money, and too much attention. Still, most remained loyal. Colombo had been good to them, had kept them earning, had kept the family united after years of war. Colombo's growing power also attracted supporters from outside his own family. Labor leaders admired his ability to rally crowds and negotiate deals. Some African-American activists even reached out, seeing parallels between Colombo's fight against stereotypes and their own struggles for equality. This only increased his public profile, making him seem less like a criminal figure and more like a social reformer. But with every new ally, Colombo seemed to gain a new enemy. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had made the mafia one of its top priorities, and Colombo's brazen activism felt like a challenge. Agents dug deeper, hoping to catch him on tax evasion, bribery, conspiracy, anything that would bring him down. Even more ominous were the private conversations happening in back rooms across New York. Some bosses, it was said, had begun to discuss whether Colombo should be removed. The mafia was a business, and any man, no matter how powerful, who put that business at risk could be replaced. Colombo, ever confident, believed that his popularity was his shield. He was not just a boss, he was a public figure with thousands of supporters. Taking him out would be messy, public, and dangerous. He told those close to him that no one would dare make a move against him in broad daylight, in front of cameras, with the world watching. And yet, there were signs that trouble was coming. Strange faces began appearing at League meetings, men who claimed to be journalists or photographers but who seemed more interested in Colombo's security arrangements than in his speeches. Rumors circulated that certain factions were quietly backing Joey Gallo, recently released from prison, who had no love for Colombo and no fear of confrontation. Still, Joe pressed on. He announced plans for a second Italian-American Unity Day rally, one even bigger than the first. He wanted to prove that the League was no passing fad, that it had staying power, that it could be a force for years to come. The preparations were extensive, permits were secured, stages rented, guest speakers lined up. Colombo personally oversaw the details, determined to make the event a triumph. It was a bold move, and a risky one. Everyone knew that if something was going to happen, if someone wanted to send a message, the rally would be the perfect place to do it. Thousands of people, cameras everywhere, Colombo front and center. The stage was set for something dramatic, though no one could guess just how dramatic it would be. As the date drew near, tension began to hum beneath the surface like a low electrical current. Colombo's supporters were excited, but his enemies were watching closely. Somewhere, in the shadows of New York, a plan was being finalized, a plan that would bring Joe Colombo's crusade to a sudden, violent halt. By the early 1970s, as the weight of law enforcement scrutiny pressed down on Joe Colombo like never before, the FBI had made him a personal project, and every day felt like a test of how long he could walk the tightrope between public crusader and underworld figure. Colombo had become, in the Bureau's eyes, the face of organized crime, the rare boss who had stepped into the light, daring them to look directly at him. Federal surveillance was constant. Wiretaps captured his phone conversations. Hidden microphones recorded his meetings. Agents followed him from his home in Queens to League offices, to restaurants, to the very social clubs where he conducted business. They took photographs from across the street, filling thick dossiers with evidence. Every handshake, every whispered conversation, every brown envelope exchanged was noted and catalogued. Colombo was indicted more than once during this period, charged with conspiracy, extortion, and perjury. Each time, he fought back with calm defiance. He hired skilled lawyers, appeared in court impeccably dressed, and maintained his composure. When reporters asked for comment, he didn't hide behind no comment. He smiled, shook his head, and told them he was being harassed for speaking out against discrimination. To many in the public, it worked. Colombo seemed less like a criminal on trial and more like a man persecuted for standing up to the government. His popularity soared. League membership swelled. The FBI's raids and subpoenas, meant to intimidate him, only seemed to make him stronger in the eyes of ordinary Italian Americans who felt targeted themselves. But inside the mafia, this was a dangerous game. The old guard had survived for decades by staying invisible, by living by the code of silence. Colombo's high profile was like a spotlight shining on all of them, and not everyone was willing to share that light. Carlo Gambino, the most powerful boss in New York, became increasingly uneasy. He was a man who preferred the quiet approach, who kept his empire running with as little noise as possible. To him, Colombo's activism was not noble, it was reckless. Gambino worried that Colombo's rallies were putting too much attention on the commission, that politicians and reporters might dig too deeply, that Congress might hold hearings, that RICO laws, new and powerful legal weapons, might be used to dismantle everything they had built. Other bosses shared his concern. Tommy Lucci's successors, Vincent Gigante of the Genovese family, and even some of Colombo's own capos whispered in back rooms that something had to be done. They didn't necessarily want Colombo dead, not at first, but they wanted him quiet. Colombo himself sensed the tension but refused to back down. He told those close to him that he was doing something bigger than just running a crime family. He believed the League was his legacy, something that would outlast him, something that would make Italian Americans stand taller. To him, retreating would be a betrayal of everything he had built. Still, the pressure began to weigh on him. The FBI's relentless pursuit meant that he had to be more careful about meetings, more selective about who he trusted. Informants were everywhere, men flipped by law enforcement who were willing to testify to save themselves. Colombo tightened security, surrounded himself with loyal bodyguards, and tried to root out anyone who might be leaking information. There was also the problem of Joey Gallo. Crazy Joe had been released from prison in 1971, just as Colombo's public campaign was reaching its peak. Gallo was a wild card, a man who thrived on chaos, and he saw Colombo's rise as an opportunity to reclaim influence. Rumors swirled that Gallo was quietly aligning with powerful backers, perhaps even with those outside the Colombo family who wanted Joe removed from power. As preparations for the second Italian-American Unity Day rally got underway, the atmosphere around Colombo grew tense. Friends urged caution. Associates warned that the rally would be the perfect opportunity for someone to make a move against him. There would be thousands of people, cameras everywhere, noise and confusion, and Colombo standing in plain view at a microphone. Colombo brushed off the warnings. He believed his popularity was his shield. No one would dare strike him in front of so many witnesses. He had walked through fire before, the prophecy wars, the commission politics, the federal trials, and survived. Why should this be any different? But there were moments when his confidence cracked, if only slightly. Some nights he stayed up late, pacing, considering who might be plotting against him. He had seen what betrayal looked like, he had lived through Magliocco's failed plot, had seen how quickly a boss could be replaced. He told his closest aides to stay vigilant, to keep their eyes open at the rally, to make sure the security was tight. The FBI, for their part, continued to watch closely. They had no interest in protecting Colombo, but they knew that an attack on him could set off a new wave of violence. Surveillance reports noted strange visitors, unfamiliar vehicles parked near league offices, suspicious phone calls. There was a sense, even among the agents, that something was building, an invisible tension calling tighter and tighter, waiting for the right moment to snap. By June of 1971, the city was buzzing with anticipation for the second rally. Flyers were printed, speakers announced, buses organized to bring in supporters from across the tri-state area. Colombo was determined that this year's turnout would be even bigger than the last, a show of strength to silence his critics and cement the League as a permanent institution. But somewhere, in some quiet apartment or backroom social club, men were speaking in hushed tones, planning something that would shake New York to its core. The stage was set, literally and figuratively, for an act that would change Joe Colombo's life forever and send shockwaves through the underworld. And as the summer sun rose higher over the city, as the date circled on the calendar drew closer, those who were watching him, friends, enemies, and federal agents alike, could feel it. The calm was ending. Something was coming. The months leading up to the second Unity Day rally were not just tense because of the FBI. They were tense because Joe Colombo's own house was no longer as unified as it once was. For years, he had been the peacemaker, the man who brought order after the bloody Prophecy Gallo conflict. But now, cracks were beginning to form, small at first, but deepening with every public appearance, every newspaper headline, every rally speech. Some of Colombo's captains were starting to grumble behind closed doors. To them, the League was not just a distraction, it was a liability. They had joined the Mafia to make money quietly, to live well without drawing attention. Colombo's activism was making their lives harder. Every time the boss appeared on television, every time his name made the front page, law enforcement pressure on the family increased. Trucks were stopped more often. Clubhouses were raided. Soldiers were being tailed on their routes. Colombo tried to reassure them. He told his men that the League was a tool, that it was giving them political connections and legitimacy they could never have achieved otherwise. This is protection, he argued. They can't call us gangsters if we're out here helping the community. And to some, that argument made sense. But to others, it felt like Colombo was playing a dangerous game with their lives. At the same time, Joey Gallo was back on the streets. Crazy Joe had been released from prison after serving nearly a decade, and he returned to Brooklyn like a storm rolling in over the harbor. Gallo had always been flamboyant, but prison had changed him. He had spent his time reading books, studying philosophy, even befriending black inmates and learning about their struggles. He came out sharper, more calculating, and more determined than ever to carve out power for himself. Gallo saw Colombo's family as weakened by all the attention. In his eyes, Colombo was too busy playing civil rights leader to keep a firm grip on the streets. Gallo started making moves, taking over small rackets, shaking down businesses, quietly recruiting discontented soldiers who felt overlooked by Colombo's administration. His crew became known as the Gallo Gang, a wild but loyal group of men who were willing to go to war if necessary. The threat was serious enough that Colombo began to worry. He increased security around himself and his family, traveling with more bodyguards, always scanning the crowd when he appeared in public. But Colombo was still determined to carry on with his activism. To back down now would be to show weakness, and weakness could be fatal in the mafia world. Tension also brewed among the younger members of the family. Some of the newer soldiers admired Gallo's style, his boldness, his defiance, his refusal to play by the old rules. Gallo had a way of making young men feel like they were part of a revolution, like they were doing more than just taking envelopes and following orders. Colombo, with his suit-and-tie diplomacy, seemed to some of them too careful, too cautious, too focused on respectability. Inside the social clubs, whispers grew louder. Would there be another war? Would the family split again, this time between Colombo loyalists and Gallo followers? And if war did come, would Colombo's political connections help him or make him an even bigger target? Colombo's allies urged him to act first, to strike at Gallo before he could build enough strength to challenge him outright. But Colombo hesitated. He had spent years promoting peace within the family, healing the wounds left by the prophecy era. To go to war again would undo all of that. He preferred to try negotiation, hoping to bring Gallo back into the fold rather than destroy him. Meetings were arranged, emissaries sent, offers made, but Gallo was not easily persuaded. He wanted more than just a seat at the table. He wanted power, influence, respect. And if Colombo would not give it to him, he was willing to take it. Meanwhile, the FBI watched with keen interest. Agents knew that another round of mafia warfare could erupt at any moment. Surveillance reports noted unusual meetings, suspicious movements of soldiers between neighborhoods, and sudden increases in gun purchases. The city's underworld felt like it was teetering on the edge of violence once again. Colombo kept pushing forward with preparations for the second Unity Day rally, even as the danger grew. To him, the rally was not just another event, it was a message. It was proof that he could lead both his family and his community, that he could stand tall in the face of government pressure and internal dissent. But his decision put his life at even greater risk. The rally would gather thousands of people, and Colombo would be front and center, impossible to miss. His security team worked tirelessly to prepare, but even the most careful plans could not account for every variable. In a crowd that large, almost anything could happen. Some of Colombo's closest advisors urged him to cancel the event or at least stay away from the stage. But Colombo refused. To not appear, he said, would be to hand victory to his enemies, to the FBI, to the press, to the gallows, to anyone who doubted him. He would be there, standing tall, speaking to his people. As the date drew nearer, the sense of inevitability thickened. The streets buzzed with rumors. Some said Gallo was planning a hit. Others said the commission had given quiet approval for Colombo to be removed. No one knew for sure. But everyone, cops, mobsters, reporters, felt that something was about to happen. In the final nights before the rally, Colombo sat in his home in Queens, talking with his family, making sure they knew how proud he was of them. He was confident, even defiant, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. He had chosen his path, and now he would have to face whatever came next. The morning of 28 June 1971 dawned bright and warm. The stage was set, the banners were hung, and thousands began to gather once again at Columbus Circle. Joe Colombo, the boss who had dared to step into the light, was about to make his most public appearance yet, and somewhere in that crowd, a man was waiting, a gun hidden just out of sight, ready to bring it all crashing down. The morning of 28 June 1971 broke bright and warm over New York City, with the kind of sunshine that made the skyscrapers glitter and the air hum with summer energy. Columbus Circle, that familiar intersection where so many thousands had gathered the year before, was alive again with movement. Banners had been strung, stages built, loudspeakers tested. The green, white, and red of the Italian flag seemed to ripple in every direction. By mid-morning, buses were arriving from across the tri-state area, unloading families who had come to show their pride. Children darted between adults holding balloons, vendors hawked pretzels and sodas, and organizers moved through the crowd, handing out signs that read, "Stop Italian discrimination" and "Justice for our people." The air buzzed with anticipation. Today was to be even bigger than the last rally, a moment that would prove the League's staying power and Joe Colombo's vision. Colombo himself was calm, composed as ever. He had dressed with care, a dark tailored suit, polished shoes, crisp white shirt. His hair was perfectly slicked back, his tie knotted just so. He moved with quiet confidence, shaking hands with supporters, smiling for photographs, even posing for a few reporters before making his way toward the stage. Around him, his bodyguards stayed close, eyes scanning constantly, hands never far from their jackets. For Colombo, this was more than just another speech. It was a statement to his supporters, to the government, to his rivals, that he was not afraid. He was still here, still standing tall, still leading. Whatever whispers had been circulating in the underworld, whatever plans had been made in smoke-filled rooms, Colombo was not backing down. The crowd swelled until it was a living sea of faces, tens of thousands pressed together, chanting, waving flags, waiting for their leader. The sounds of the city faded beneath the roar of human voices and the crackle of the pass system. When the announcer called Colombo's name, the cheers were deafening. He stepped forward onto the wooden stage, the sun glinting off his hair, his hand raised in a wave. Photographers jostled for position, cameras clicking furiously. Colombo turned toward the microphone, preparing to speak, his face breaking into the faintest of smiles. And then it happened. Somewhere near the front of the crowd, a man moved forward. Jerome Johnson, a 24-year-old African-American dressed in a suit and tie, with a press badge hanging from his lapel. Witnesses would later say he seemed calm, almost too calm, as he raised the camera slung around his neck. But instead of snapping a photo, he pulled out a small revolver. There was no warning, no shouted threat, no time to react. 3 sharp cracks rang out in quick succession, sounding almost like firecrackers at first. Colombo staggered where he stood, his face suddenly frozen in shock. One bullet struck him in the head, another in the neck, a third grazed him. He crumpled to the stage, his bodyguards screaming, diving toward him, toward the gunman. The crowd erupted into chaos. People screamed, pushed, ducked. Some dropped to the ground, others tried to run, their signs and flags trampled underfoot. Mothers clutched their children, fathers shouted for their families, panic rippling through the mass of bodies like a wave. On stage, Colombo's men swarmed the shooter. They wrestled him to the ground and beat him savagely, the revolver clattering to the wooden boards. Police rushed in, pulling the gunman away, but it was too late. Colombo lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his head, staining the boards dark. Reporters captured the aftermath in frantic photographs, the boss being lifted by his bodyguards, his face pale, his eyes closed, his once perfect suit stained red. Medics rushed forward, loading him onto a stretcher, their hands moving quickly, desperately, as they tried to stop the bleeding. The sirens of an ambulance wailed as he was carried away, disappearing into the crowded streets. In the chaos, Jerome Johnson was shot and killed at the scene, whether by police or by Colombo's enraged bodyguards was never conclusively determined. What was clear was that the man who had fired the shots would never speak, never reveal who had sent him, never explain why he had done it. As word spread across the city, shock gave way to fear. New Yorkers who had woken up to a day of celebration now turned on their radios and televisions to hear urgent bulletins. Joe Colombo, head of the Colombo crime family and founder of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, had been shot at point-blank range in front of thousands of witnesses. Doctors fought to save him. Hours passed as surgeons worked, the city waiting for updates. When the news finally came, it was grim but miraculous. Colombo had survived. He was alive but barely. The bullets had done catastrophic damage. He had slipped into a coma from which he would never fully awaken. That evening, Columbus Circle was quiet again, eerily so. The stage stood empty, abandoned, splintered by the violence of the day. Torn flags fluttered in the summer breeze, trampled signs lay scattered on the ground. It was as though the life had been drained from the place where just hours before there had been singing, chanting, pride. For the underworld, the message was unmistakable. Someone, whether a lone gunman, a rival family, or someone within Colombo's own ranks, had decided that Joe Colombo had gone too far. He had broken the code of silence, and the price had been paid. And yet, the act had not removed him from power entirely. Colombo still lived, though trapped in a twilight state between life and death. His family, his loyalists, his supporters, they all faced a painful question: who would lead now, and what would become of everything Joe had built? In the weeks that followed, New York seemed to hold its breath. The FBI watched closely, fearing reprisals, fearing a gang war that might turn the city streets red once again. The other bosses moved carefully, not wanting to trigger unnecessary violence but quietly beginning to maneuver for influence over Colombo's family. But for the thousands who had come to Columbus' circle that day, the image that stayed with them was not of power plays or politics. It was of Joe Colombo lying on the stage, his dream of bringing the mafia out of the shadows shattered in a spray of gunfire, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. In the days following the shooting, New York City felt strangely muted, as if the entire metropolis was holding its breath. Columbus Circle had been cleared and cleaned, but those who passed by still slowed down, staring at the spot where Joe Colombo had fallen. The newspapers were filled with headlines and photographs, images of Colombo being carried to the ambulance, of panicked crowds scattering, of police struggling to control the chaos. For a city used to violence, this had been something different, a mafia boss shot in front of thousands, in broad daylight, with cameras rolling. Colombo lay in a hospital bed, machines beeping steadily, doctors and nurses working around the clock to keep him alive. The bullets had done devastating damage, shattering part of his skull and leaving him in a deep coma. Though he was technically alive, the doctors told his family the truth in hushed tones. There was little chance he would ever regain consciousness. At best, he might survive in a vegetative state. For Colombo's wife, Lucy, and their children, it was a cruel limbo. They visited him daily, holding his hand, speaking softly, hoping for a flicker of recognition. Friends and allies came too, standing silently at his bedside, some praying, some just staring. The man who had been so full of energy, who had commanded crowds with his voice, now lay silent, a motionless figure surrounded by tubes and wires. Outside the hospital, the world kept turning, and the mafia wasted no time in adjusting to the new reality. A power vacuum had opened in the Colombo family, and that was something no organization could tolerate for long. Decisions had to be made: who would lead? Who would keep the money flowing, the rackets running, the soldiers loyal? At first, there was confusion. Colombo's loyalists insisted that Joe was still the boss, that no one would take his place while he still drew breath. But the commission, the governing council of the mafia, knew that a family without active leadership was vulnerable. It could splinter, it could be taken over, it could bring chaos to the streets. Into this uncertainty stepped Carmine Persico. Persico had been one of Colombo's most trusted men, a shrewd and capable capo who had survived the Gallo wars and built a reputation as a cunning strategist. He was known for his intelligence and his ability to inspire loyalty, as well as for a ruthlessness that earned him the nickname the Snake. Persico began consolidating power quietly, visiting key captains, assuring them that he would keep the family stable in Colombo's absence. Not everyone agreed with Persico's rise. Some captains had their own ambitions, others distrusted him, still others feared that his aggressive style would reignite old conflicts. But Persico moved carefully, making alliances where he could, using quiet pressure where he had to, until his control became more or less accepted. The Gallo faction, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Joey Gallo had been waiting for a moment like this, and with Colombo incapacitated, he began pushing harder, taking over rackets, making bold moves to expand his influence. Violence flared again on the streets: shootings, beatings, bombings. It was as though the bloodshed of the prophecy wars had returned, this time with new players and higher stakes. The FBI watched closely, almost warily. They had not expected the shooting to throw the mafia into such turbulence, But now they realized that the underworld was once again shifting beneath their feet. Agents kept Colombo's hospital under surveillance, noting who visited, who lingered in the parking lot, who whispered in corners. To them, Colombo had become more than just a man. He was a symbol, a rallying point, a ghostly presence that might still influence the family's direction. In the League offices, there was mourning. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, once a source of pride and energy, now felt adrift. Some members tried to keep it going, organizing meetings, planning events, but without Colombo's charisma at the center, attendance dwindled. The press, once eager to cover every rally and speech, gradually moved on to other stories. And yet, the shadow of Joe Colombo still loomed large. His name continued to command respect on the streets. Soldiers who had served under him still spoke of him with reverence, still invoked his name when collecting debts or negotiating deals. To many, Colombo was still the boss, even if he would never again give an order. The months stretched into years, and Joe's condition never improved. He remained in a near-vegetative state, tended to by his family with unwavering devotion. There were occasional moments of hope, a twitch of a finger, a change in breathing, but they never amounted to real recovery. For the underworld, it was as if he had become a living ghost, a reminder of what had been lost and of how fragile power could be. As time passed, the family moved on under Persico's leadership, but the wound never fully healed. The shooting had changed everything, not just for the Colombo family, but for the mafia as a whole. It was a stark warning of what could happen when a boss stepped too far into the light, when the old rules of secrecy and silence were broken. And yet, the question of who had truly ordered the hit lingered unanswered. The gunman was dead. No one claimed responsibility. Was it the gallows? Was it someone inside Colombo's own family? Or was it, as some whispered, a conspiracy involving the commission itself, a decision made by men who believed Colombo's activism had endangered them all? Those questions would haunt the streets for years, even as the Colombo family continued its business, even as wars flared and subsided, even as Joe himself remained locked in silence. In the quiet of his hospital room, surrounded by the hum of machines, Joe Colombo still breathed. And as long as he breathed, the story was not quite over. The shooting of Joe Colombo had thrown the entire underworld into disarray, but if there was one man who seemed to thrive in the chaos, it was Joey Gallo. Crazy Joe had been waiting for his chance to strike ever since he walked out of prison earlier that year. With Colombo lying motionless in a hospital bed, Gallo saw an opening, a chance to reclaim territory, rebuild his crew, and perhaps even seize control of the entire family. Brooklyn once again became the stage for a quiet, deadly struggle. Gallo's men moved swiftly, muscling into rackets that had once belonged to Colombo loyalists. They collected gambling debts, hijacked trucks, and re-established their presence in the bars and social clubs of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens. It was a bold move, one that sent a clear message: the gallows were back, and they were not afraid. The response was swift. Under Carmine Persico's emerging leadership, Colombo loyalists struck back. There were shootings in the streets, bodies found in cars, bombings that shook the night air. Ordinary citizens felt the tension once again, as if the city had slipped backward into the days of the Prophesy Gallo War. People kept their heads down, knowing that a stray bullet could easily find the wrong target. But Joey Gallo was not an ordinary gangster. He relished the attention, lived for the chaos. Unlike Colombo, who had tried to run a quiet, businesslike operation, Gallo turned his crew into something theatrical. He courted celebrities, befriended artists and writers, and became a figure in New York nightlife. He was seen at fashionable clubs in Manhattan, dining at Elaine's with actors and comedians, soaking in the glow of notoriety. Gallo's style was dangerous, not just because it brought more heat from law enforcement, but because it angered his enemies. Persico and his allies saw him as a threat that needed to be eliminated before he grew too powerful. The war between the two factions escalated through late 1971 and into 1972, each side losing men, each side refusing to back down. Then came the night of 7th April 1972. It was Gallo's birthday, and he was in high spirits. He had spent the evening celebrating at the Copacabana nightclub in Manhattan with friends and his new wife, Sina Essari. After leaving the club, the group made their way to Little Italy, ending up at a small restaurant that would soon become infamous, Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street. The hour was late past 4 in the morning when Gallo and his party entered the restaurant. The place was small, with just a handful of tables, the air thick with the smell of garlic, clams, and frying oil. Gallo, as always, seemed relaxed, laughing with his companions, ordering seafood, enjoying the moment. But outside, in the cool early morning air, gunmen were closing in. They had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What happened next was sudden and brutal. The door of the restaurant burst open, and several men rushed inside with guns drawn. The quiet of the late-night eatery exploded with noise, the deafening sound of gunfire, the shouts of terrified patrons diving under tables, the crash of plates and glasses hitting the floor. Joey Gallo leapt to his feet, overturning a table, trying to draw his own weapon, but it was too late. Bullets tore through the room, striking him multiple times. He staggered out the door, bleeding, collapsing onto the sidewalk just outside the restaurant. Witnesses later said the scene was surreal, Gallo lying in the street under the glow of a neon sign, the smell of cordite hanging in the air, his white shirt soaked with blood. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Gallo was gone. The man who had defied bosses, who had survived prison, who had built a reputation as one of the boldest figures in New York's underworld, lay dead on the pavement. News of the murder spread quickly. By dawn, the story was on every front page. The name Crazy Joe once again splashed across headlines. For some, his death was a relief, a signal that the war might finally be ending. For others, it was a warning. The Colombo family under Persico was willing to go to any lengths to protect its power. At Umberto's, the bloodstains were scrubbed from the floor, but the restaurant would forever be remembered as the site of one of the most famous mob hits in history. Tourists still flock there today, some whispering about that night, imagining the scene, picturing the gunmen bursting through the door. The killing of Gallo did not end the violence immediately. Revenge begets revenge, and the cycle of shootings continued for months. But gradually, the Colombo family regained control of its territories, forcing the remaining Gallo loyalists to retreat or disappear. Persico's position as acting boss was cemented, and the family, though scarred, began to stabilize. Yet, the shadow of Joe Colombo still hung over everything. He was still alive, still lying in that hospital bed, breathing but silent. His presence was a reminder of how this new war had begun, and of how fragile the peace truly was. In some ways, the murder of Joey Gallo marked the end of an era, the closing of a bloody chapter in the Colombo family's history. But it also marked the beginning of a new one, a time when Carmine Persico would consolidate power and lead the family into the future, even as Colombo's name continued to command respect. For the public, however, what remained most vivid was the image of Little Italy in the early morning hours, the neon glow of Mulberry Street, the sound of gunfire echoing between the buildings, and Joey Gallo lying on the pavement. It was the stuff of noir novels and crime films, except this was real, and it was happening right in the heart of New York. After the gunfire at Columbus Circle, after the chaos and the sirens and the headlines, Joe Colombo's world became a single, dimly lit hospital room. Machines breathed for him, monitors tracked his heart rate, nurses tended to him in shifts. He had survived, yes, but survival was not the same as living. The once charismatic man who had commanded crowds now lay silent, eyes closed, trapped in a coma that would last for 7 long years. For his family, the hospital became a second home. His wife, Lucy, rarely left his side in those early months. She would sit by his bed, holding his hand, speaking to him softly about the children, about the neighborhood, about the world outside. Sometimes she played his favorite music, hoping the familiar sounds might stir something in him. There were moments when Joe seemed to respond, a twitch of the fingers, a flicker of the eyelids, but the doctors were clear, these were reflexes, not signs of recovery. As the years passed, the family adapted to a new rhythm. Mornings spent getting children ready for school, afternoons running errands, evenings sitting in the hospital room, talking to Joe as though he could hear every word. Friends and allies visited too, some out of loyalty, some out of respect, some out of guilt. They stood at his bedside, speaking in low tones, sometimes just standing silently, as if paying homage to a fallen king. Outside the hospital walls, the world moved on. The Colombo crime family continued under Carmine Persico's leadership, fighting off challengers, reasserting control. Wars flared, rackets shifted, money continued to flow. But for many inside the family, there was still a sense that Joe's presence lingered, that they were running the family in his shadow. His name still carried weight on the streets. Soldiers still spoke of him as the boss, even though he could no longer give orders. The Italian-American Civil Rights League struggled without its founder's charisma. Attendance at rallies dwindled, donations slowed, and the organization gradually faded from the public eye. The movement that had once been front-page news now existed as a whisper, a memory of a time when one man had dared to step into the light and demand dignity for his people. Colombo's own physical condition remained largely unchanged. There were occasional attempts at rehabilitation, exercises to keep his muscles from atrophying, medical interventions to prevent infection, but his mind remained far away, unreachable. Lucille stayed hopeful, praying daily for a miracle, telling visitors that she believed he might still wake up. Years blurred together. Birthdays were celebrated at his bedside, holidays too. His children grew older, their lives moving forward, but they always came back to that quiet room to sit with their father. In a way, those visits kept Joe connected to the world he had fought to shape. For the underworld, Colombo's state became a kind of living symbol, a warning of what could happen to a man who stepped too far out of the shadows. Other bosses took note. Few dared to put themselves in front of cameras as boldly as Colombo had. His fate seemed to reinforce the old mafia maxim, silence is safety, secrecy is survival. And yet, there was still a sense of unfinished business surrounding his name. The question of who had ordered the hit was never answered. The shooter was dead, but speculations whirled endlessly. Was it the gallows seeking revenge? Was it someone within Colombo's own family, acting on orders from the commission? Or was it, as some of his loyalists believed, an outside conspiracy meant to punish him for standing up to the FBI? By 1978, 7 years had passed since the shooting. Colombo's health began to decline rapidly. Complications set in: infections, organ failure, and despite the best efforts of his doctors, it became clear that the end was near. His family gathered around him, as they had so many times before, holding his hands, speaking softly, telling him how much he was loved. On 22nd May 1978, Joe Colombo passed away at the age of 54. The news spread quickly through the neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens, through the social clubs and cafes where his name had once been spoken with reverence. For many, it felt like the closing of a chapter that had begun not just with his rise to boss, but with the hope and controversy of his public crusade. Colombo's funeral was a large affair, attended by hundreds. Friends, family, and old associates gathered to pay their respects. The coffin was draped in flowers, the church filled with the sound of prayers and the scent of incense. Some wept openly, others stood in silence, their faces unreadable. For all the bloodshed, for all the controversy, Joe Colombo was remembered by many as a man who had tried to do something different, a man who had wanted more than just power, who had wanted respect. When he was finally laid to rest, it was as though a weight lifted from the city. The long vigil was over. The man who had lain between life and death for 7 years was finally at peace. But his story was not truly finished. His name lived on not just in the history of the mafia, but in the memory of the neighborhoods he had come from, in the families who still told stories of the day they saw him speak, in the films and books that would later depict his era. Joe Colombo, the boss who became an activist, remained a figure of fascination, a man who had dared to bring the underworld into the daylight and paid the ultimate price for it. In the quiet years after Joe Colombo's death, his story refused to fade. His name was still spoken in hushed tones in the neighborhoods where he had once walked, still invoked by old-timers in social clubs, still studied by law enforcement as a case unlike any other. Colombo was not just another boss who had risen and fallen, he had been something different, something rare. He had dared to take the life of a Mafia Don, a life normally spent in the shadows, and place it directly in front of the public eye. For many Italian Americans, Colombo's legacy was tied to the league he had founded. The Italian American Civil Rights League, even in its diminished state after his shooting, had succeeded in making its point. Newspapers and television networks became more cautious about using the word mafia as a blanket term for Italian Americans. The League had pressured the FBI to limit its public use of the term Cosa Nostra, forcing the Bureau to draw a sharper line between criminal organizations and the millions of law-abiding Italian citizens in America. Perhaps Colombo's most surprising cultural impact was on Hollywood. At the time Paramount Pictures was preparing to film The Godfather, the League launched protests, arguing that the movie would further entrench stereotypes about Italians. The producers met with League representatives, and after intense negotiations, references to mafia were removed from the film's script. The resulting movie would become one of the most iconic films of all time, a sweeping saga of power, loyalty, and family, and Colombo's League had played a quiet role in shaping its final form. For Colombo's supporters, this was proof that his activism had not been in vain. He had used his platform, however controversial, to demand respect for his people and had left behind tangible results. To them, he was more than a crime boss. He was a defender of dignity, a man who took risks to protect his community from what he saw as unfair treatment. But for his critics, Colombo's legacy was more complicated. They argued that the League was less about civil rights and more about self-preservation, a shield to deflect attention from his criminal empire. Some historians and law enforcement officials have suggested that Colombo's activism was a calculated move designed to make it politically costly for the government to prosecute him. By turning himself into a public figure, Colombo made it harder for the FBI to target him without appearing to target the entire Italian-American community. There is truth in both views. Colombo was, undeniably, a man of contradictions. He was both a devoted husband and father, and a man who ran gambling, extortion, and loan-sharking operations. He was a boss who preferred diplomacy, but was not afraid of violence when it was necessary. He was a champion of respectability who nevertheless lived outside the law. What made Colombo's story so compelling and so enduring was this very tension. He was not a simple figure, not easily reduced to hero or villain. His life seemed to embody the larger story of organized crime in America, the struggle between tradition and modernity, between secrecy and exposure, between the desire for respect and the hunger for power. The underworld learned its own lessons from Colombo's life and death. After the shooting, few bosses were willing to step into the public eye as boldly as he had. The old code of silence reasserted itself with renewed strength. The mafia returned to the shadows, operating quietly, avoiding publicity. Colombo had shown what could happen when a boss became too visible, and no one wanted to pay that price again. And yet, Colombo also left behind a kind of blueprint for what it meant to be more than just a gangster. His ability to blend the role of Don with the role of activist, his willingness to speak on behalf of his community, and his refusal to be defined solely by the government's labels left a mark that went beyond organized crime. In the years after his death, writers, journalists, and filmmakers continued to be fascinated by him. Books were written exploring his life, some painting him as a folk hero, others as a dangerous criminal who nearly brought ruin to the mafia by attracting too much attention. Documentaries revisited the rallies at Columbus Circle, showing black and white footage of Colombo speaking to the cheering crowds. For the people who had been there that day, the memory remained sharp. They remembered the pride they had felt, the sense that someone powerful was standing up for them. They remembered the flags waving, the chants, the speeches. And then the gunshots that had turned triumph into tragedy. Even in death, Colombo remained a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a man who broke the rules and paid for it. Others saw him as a man who tried to change the rules, to redefine what it meant to be a Don in the modern age. Perhaps he was both. In the end, Joe Colombo's greatest legacy might be the questions he left behind. Was he a visionary, ahead of his time, trying to bridge the gap between the underworld and legitimate society? Or was he simply a man whose ambition outgrew the code he had sworn to live by, whose boldness brought his own downfall? The answers depend on who you ask. What cannot be denied is that Joe Colombo changed the story of organized crime in America. He was the only boss to step so far into the light, the only boss to put his name on rallies, to speak to reporters, to make himself a public figure. He was the only boss who became an activist, and the last. And for that reason, his story still echoes today, half a century later, a story of power and pride, of ambition and tragedy, of a man who tried to stand with one foot in two worlds and found that neither would fully accept him. After Joe Colombo's passing in 1978, the family that bore his name faced the future without its founder. For years, Colombo had existed in a strange state, alive but absent, and during that time Carmine Persico had risen to become the unquestioned leader. Now, with Joe gone, Persico's control became official. Carmine the Snake Persico was a different kind of boss than Colombo. Where Joe had favored diplomacy and a public-facing approach, Persico was secretive, cunning, and relentless. He ruled with a mix of intelligence and quiet menace, preferring to pull strings from behind the scenes. Under his leadership, the Colombo family re-established itself as a force to be reckoned with in New York's underworld. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Colombo family thrived financially. They continued to control lucrative rackets, loan sharking, extortion, gambling, labor racketeering. Persico himself was a master at leveraging control of unions, especially in the construction industry, which allowed the family to take a piece of nearly every major project in the city. Trucks were delayed, concrete was poured, or not poured based on decisions made in Persico's orbit. The money flowed steadily, and for a time the family seemed as strong as it had been under Colombo. But Persico's reign was not without turbulence. In the 1980s, the federal government intensified its war on organized crime, using the powerful RICO Act to go after entire families instead of just individuals. The Mafia Commission trial of 1985 to 1986 became one of the most significant prosecutions in American legal history, and Carmine Persico was at its center. Persico shocked many by choosing to represent himself in court, standing before the jury in a tailored suit, cross-examining witnesses, and delivering closing arguments. Some observers said he performed brilliantly, showing intelligence and confidence. But it was not enough. Persico was convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 100 years in prison. Despite this, he continued to run the family from behind bars, earning him a reputation as one of the most enduring and perhaps most stubborn bosses in mafia history. It was during Persico's imprisonment that the family's darkest chapter began, the Colombo family wars. The first internal war broke out in the early 1980s, but the second, beginning in 1991, was particularly bloody. The conflict was sparked by a challenge from acting boss Victor Orena, who sought to take control of the family while Persico remained incarcerated. Orena argued that the family needed active, hands-on leadership and that Persico's continued rule from prison was holding them back. The dispute quickly escalated into open warfare. Murders and ambushes became almost daily occurrences. Gun battles erupted in the streets, in parking lots, even outside restaurants in broad daylight. The newspapers dubbed it the Third Colombo War, and for good reason. It was as bloody as the earlier conflicts of the Prophecy and Gallo years. Over the course of several years, nearly 100 people were killed or wounded. Associates and innocent bystanders alike were caught in the crossfire. Law enforcement poured resources into monitoring the conflict, arresting key figures on both sides and eventually breaking the back of Orena's faction. Persico's loyalists emerged victorious, but the family had been badly weakened. By the late 1990s, the Colombo family had become known less for its business acumen and more for its internal chaos. The other four families, the Gambinos, Genoveses, Lucheses, and Bonanos, often viewed the Colombos as the most unstable of the five, plagued by infighting and betrayal. The name that Joe had once proudly attached to the family now carried a reputation for volatility. And yet, the shadow of Joe Colombo still lingered. Older soldiers and capos remembered his efforts to unify the family, to run it like a business rather than a battlefield. They spoke of him with a kind of wistful respect, as if to say that things had once been better, more orderly, under his leadership. In the 2000s and beyond, the Colombo family gradually declined in power, as did much of the American mafia. Federal prosecutions, undercover operations, and the fading of the old guard left the family a shell of what it had once been. Still, the organization never fully disappeared, continuing to operate in smaller rackets, a shadow of its former self. Even today, the Colombo family carries the name of its founder, a rarity in the mafia world, where most families are named after long-dead bosses. That fact alone speaks to the lasting impact Joe had. For all the bloodshed that came after him, for all the wars and betrayals, his name endures as a symbol of a man who once dared to lead differently. In many ways, the story of the Colombo family after Joe's death mirrors the story of organized crime in America as a whole, a peak of power, followed by federal crackdowns, internal wars, and a slow decline into something quieter, smaller, but still persistent. The world had changed, and the mafia had been forced to change with it. But in the neighborhoods where Joe Colombo was born and rose to power, his memory remains entwined with the identity of the family. The name over the door, the Colombo family, is a reminder of the boy from Carroll Gardens who became a boss, an activist, and a target. It is a reminder that for a brief moment in history, one man brought the underworld into the light of day and tried to reshape its place in the world. With time, Joe Colombo's story took on a life of its own, growing beyond the man himself. The image of the fallen boss lying on the wooden stage at Columbus Circle became one of the most enduring photographs in the history of organized crime, a single moment that captured the danger, the drama, and the contradictions of his life. But like so many figures in the underworld, Colombo's story became as much myth as fact, retold in countless ways over the decades. Writers and journalists were fascinated by him almost immediately. In the years after the shooting, magazine features and books sought to unravel the mystery. Who was really behind the assassination attempt? Was Colombo a crusader for justice, a cunning manipulator, or perhaps both? True crime authors pored over FBI files, interviewed associates, and painted portraits of a man who seemed to straddle two worlds, the quiet, respectable family man and the calculating don who oversaw gambling and extortion rackets. Hollywood, too, could not resist his story. Although no major film has been dedicated solely to Joe Colombo, elements of his life have appeared in gangster movies and television series for decades. The idea of a don stepping into the public eye, of a boss who becomes almost a celebrity, has shown up in characters that audiences recognize, men who are at once feared and admired, who balance crime with a strange kind of charisma. Documentaries and TV specials have also revisited his life. Grainy black and white footage of the Unity Day rallies, with flags waving and Colombo speaking passionately into a microphone, is often contrasted with footage of his stretcher being rushed to the ambulance. The effect is haunting, a rise and fall condensed into a few minutes of film. These documentaries often play up the mystery surrounding his shooting, inviting viewers to wonder, was it a lone gunman, a rogue faction, a government conspiracy? The unanswered question becomes part of the drama, keeping Colombo's story alive for new generations. In pop culture, Colombo has sometimes been romanticized as a kind of noble outlaw, a man who wanted respect not just for himself but for his people. This version of Colombo paints him as almost heroic, standing up to government overreach, fighting stereotypes, demanding dignity for Italian Americans. It's an appealing narrative, especially for those who lived through the era and remember how pervasive and hurtful the mafia label could be. But there is another version of Colombo's story, one that strips away the romance and looks at the harder truths. This version remembers that Colombo was, first and foremost, a mafia boss, a man who made his fortune through illegal means, who relied on fear and violence to enforce his will, who ran rackets that exploited the very neighborhoods he sought to protect. His league may have fought discrimination, but it also reportedly collected donations in ways that were not always voluntary. Historians point out that Colombo's activism may have been as much about strategy as about principle. By rallying the Italian-American community, he built a shield of public sympathy around himself at a time when indictments and federal cases were closing in. When the FBI raided his operations or brought charges, Colombo could claim persecution, framing it as an attack on all Italian Americans rather than on himself personally. This tension between Colombo the activist and Colombo the boss is what makes his story so enduring. People are drawn to complexity, to figures who defy easy categorization. Colombo was neither purely good nor purely evil. He was a man who loved his family, who could be generous and charming, and who also ran an empire built on crime. Even within the mafia, opinions about him remain divided. Some old-timers still speak of him with respect, calling him a visionary who kept the family united and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Others view him as reckless, a man who nearly brought disaster upon all 5 families by drawing so much attention to their existence. The media continues to revisit his life because it is a story that has everything: power, loyalty, betrayal, and tragedy. It has the sweep of a classic gangster saga, but also the intimacy of a family drama. Colombo's life invites questions about identity, justice, and what it means to seek respect in a world that defines you by your heritage. Today, Colombo exists as much in the realm of storytelling as in history. True crime podcasts recount his rise and fall with dramatic flair, YouTube channels analyze the political implications of his activism, and books revisit the case with fresh theories about who might have been behind the assassination attempt. Each retelling adds another layer, another interpretation, another shade of meaning. What makes Colombo's story particularly haunting is that it never quite reaches a conclusion. His shooting did not bring immediate closure. He lingered for years in a coma, leaving both his family and his rivals in a kind of suspended state. His death closed the chapter, but the mystery remained open. That unfinished quality keeps listeners and readers coming back, searching for answers that may never come. In the end, Joe Colombo's myth is perhaps as powerful as the man himself. He is remembered as both sinner and saint, as both gangster and activist, as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of pride. Whether one sees him as a tragic hero or as a dangerous outlaw, his life continues to spark fascination. And maybe that is the truest measure of his legacy, that decades after the gunfire at Columbus Circle, people are still telling his story, still debating his motives, still wondering what might have happened if he had lived, if he had spoken at that rally, finished that speech, led his family and his league into a future he had imagined but never had the chance to see. The story of Joe Colombo does not end with the sound of gunfire or the closing of a casket. His story lingers, echoing through the streets of Brooklyn, through the history of organized crime, through the hearts of those who still debate what kind of man he truly was. To understand Joe Colombo is to understand a man who tried to stand in two worlds, one foot in the shadows of the mafia, the other in the light of public activism, and who ultimately discovered that those worlds could not coexist without exacting a terrible price. When we think back to Colombo's early life, it is easy to picture him as the boy from Carroll Gardens, walking the narrow streets lined with tenements and bakeries, learning the unspoken rules of respect and loyalty. He was shaped by the loss of his father, by the toughness of the neighborhood, by the quiet resolve of his mother. From those beginnings, he rose, first as a soldier, then a captain, and finally the boss of a family that would forever bear his name. There is something almost cinematic about the arc of his life. He was the youngest boss in New York, a man who brought peace to a fractured organization, who believed in diplomacy over bloodshed. At his peak, he was powerful, respected, and perhaps even beloved by those who worked for him. And then, at the height of his power, he did something no other boss had dared to do. He stepped out of the shadows and into the light, declaring not just his presence but his cause. For a moment, it seemed as though he might succeed in changing the rules. The rallies were massive, the speeches passionate, the movement growing. Colombo seemed untouchable until the day he wasn't. That moment on the wooden stage at Columbus Circle froze him in time, transformed him from a living, breathing man into a symbol, into a question that would haunt New York's underworld for decades. What makes Colombo's story so haunting is not just the violence of his fall, but the long shadow of his survival. For 7 years, he lay between life and death, a figure both present and absent. In that time, wars were fought, leaders rose and fell, the world outside kept moving, but Colombo stayed still, a silent reminder of what ambition and defiance can cost. When he finally passed away, there was a sense of relief, yes, but also of sadness, the closing of a chapter that had defined an era. The man who had dared to bring the mafia out of the shadows was gone, but the questions he raised remained. Could the mafia ever exist in daylight? Could a man be both a criminal and a public figure, both a don and a community leader? Or was Colombo's fate proof that the two worlds would always collide, violently, until one destroyed the other? For Italian Americans, Colombo's legacy remains complicated. To some, he was a champion who gave them pride at a time when they were being stereotyped and maligned. To others, he was a man who used activism as a shield, who endangered his own community by bringing law enforcement pressure down upon them. And for the underworld, Colombo became a cautionary tale. After his shooting, few bosses ever tried to follow in his footsteps. The code of silence was reaffirmed, secrecy re-established as the bedrock of survival. In a sense, the mafia learned that day that visibility was a liability, that the higher a man climbed into the public eye, the easier it was for someone to take aim. Yet there is a strange nobility to Colombo's gamble. He could have remained in the shadows, quietly making money, quietly ruling his family. Instead, he tried to shape history, to fight for respect, to redefine what it meant to be an Italian American in an age when the word mafia hung over entire communities like a cloud. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps it was idealism, perhaps it was both. But it was undeniably bold. As we close his story, we are left with an image. Not of the shooting, not of the hospital bed, but of Joe Colombo standing at the microphone on that first sunny day at Columbus Circle. The flags are waving, the crowd is cheering, and he is smiling, proud, determined, speaking not just as a boss but as a man who believed in something larger than himself. In that moment, he is more than a gangster. He is a father thinking about his children's future. He is a son thinking about the hardships of his parents. He is a man who has seen the streets at their worst and who dares to imagine them better. When the lights go out, when the city quiets, when the last pages of his story are read, Joe Colombo remains a figure suspended between myth and reality. His life reminds us that power comes with a price, that every choice carries consequences, and that the line between respect and ruin can be razor thin. So as the night deepens and this story draws to a close, we leave Joe Colombo where history left him, a man both celebrated and condemned, remembered and debated, a man who became more than just another name in the annals of organized crime. He became a symbol of ambition, defiance, and the impossible dream of living in two worlds at once. And perhaps that is why we still tell his story, because it is, at its heart, a human story. A story of striving and falling, of risk and consequence, of pride and tragedy. A story that asks us to think about what we would dare to stand for, and what price we would be willing to pay.